This is Robin Stripling with the Special Education Unit at the Department of Education. This is part 2 in a series about accommodations and modifications. Part 1 was about the difference in accommodations and modifications. This one, part 2, will be classroom supports and testing accommodations, and part 3 will be choosing and providing accommodations. Resources spoken about may be found in a live binder at tinyurl.com/spedrs under the pink tab. So a quick review here. There are 3 kinds of adaptations. First, accessibility features, then accommodations, which are for classroom instruction and testing, and modifications, which are just for classroom instruction because they are not allowed on statewide testing. Accessibility features are relatively new to us. ACT Aspire calls them open access features. These are available to any student who may need them, not just students with 504s or IEPs. They just need to be selected on the student's P&P. These can be things like dictated responses, small group testing, or one-on-one testing. Again, any student can have these. And just a brief overview on the difference in accommodations, and modifications. Accommodations do not change the learning expectations for a student. Modifications do change the learning expectations for a student. So let's think about accommodations. These are practices and procedures in 4 different areas: presentation, response, setting, and timing and scheduling, and we will go into each of these in depth. There is a document in the live binder called Types of Accommodations that lists many accommodations for each of these areas. Accommodations are meant to provide equitable access during instruction and assessment. They are meant to level the playing field and reduce or eliminate the effects of the student's disability. They do not change the learning expectations for the student. So let's look first at presentation accommodations. These are the things that will help a student receive the information in that classroom, how the information is presented to the student. It may be using things like text-to-speech or audio books. Could be things like sign language or large print. So how the information is presented to the student. Response is how the student responds and shows understanding. Can be things like speech-to-text or a voice recorder, using graphic organizers for the student to show what he or she has learned. And many of these can be provided to any student. Speech-to-text is something that many students are using now because of the ease of use of that support. Setting is really the student's environment. Things like special grouping, perhaps using special equipment or reducing distractions. Timing and scheduling, we usually think of extended time. It could also be things like frequent breaks or even changing that student's schedule. If the student does much better in the morning, you would want to make sure that that student has core content classes during that time when he or she is more likely to be able to focus in that classroom. So we need to make wise decisions about accommodations, beginning with expecting all students to achieve grade level academic standards. And we need to know about accommodations both for instruction and for assessment and what types of accommodations are available. We need to select them based on individual student needs. It is interesting, sometimes we'll see a large group of students who have the same accommodations listed on their IEPs. Those accommodations need to be administered both during instruction and during assessment. And probably most importantly, we need to evaluate and improve the use of accommodations. We can't know if an accommodation is beneficial for a student unless we document that accommodation's use. How much time does a student actually use on assignments and tests? Does that student actually need extended time? Does the student actually want text or tests to be read aloud? I remember at the last school where I taught, it was the last year, a benchmark, and I was doing a read aloud accommodation for a group of students, and a young man said, "Please don't read that to me. It distracts me when you read out loud." And I thought, well, great, it's on his IEP. What am I supposed to do about this? So we do need to evaluate those accommodations and see if they are actually beneficial for those individual students. We can use a backward design process to make sure that all students learn the information that they need to learn. The backward design process can be used to help plan lessons and can be broken down into 3 major steps or components. First, the teacher needs to identify the desired results from the students. Sometimes these are identified as the big ideas or the essential understandings. Once that is decided, assessments must be determined so that we will see how that student will show what he or she has learned about those big ideas or essential understandings. What will be our summative assessment? And after we have determined the big ideas that we want the students to learn and that summative assessment that we will use to make sure that they have those essential understandings, finally, the learning experience and instruction, that process is determined. And by following these 3 steps using the backward design, you can be assured that the big ideas, the assessment, and the process are all aligned. Can there be several types of acceptable evidence for each learning experience? Can students have choice in the way that that understanding is demonstrated? So these are some places that you may want to explore to learn more about accommodations. Ryan Kettler has an audio file that is really interesting about accommodations and whether or not they are fair. Unfortunately, there are still teachers out there who consider accommodations not fair for the other students who don't receive those accommodations. Wright's Law is a website that parents often use. They have great information both for parents but also for teachers. And you may want to read about this case, Doe versus Withers. This was actually a teacher who refused to provide an accommodation for a student, even though the administrators in the district were insistent that he provide this accommodation. He refused. And at the very end, the family was awarded $15,000 in damages from this actual teacher, not the district. So just something to keep in mind, a little bit frightening there. So understood.org is another website that parents often use. Some great information about accommodations there and the difference that they can make for students. So this is an example from the ACT Aspire Abacet. It is a 7th grade math problem that is given just to show what the types of problems are that will be on ACT Aspire. So let me just read this to you. Elaine's Grocery has a lunch counter where people can order 3 types of sandwiches: egg salad, chicken salad, or falafel. Sandwiches can be made with 2 types of bread, pita or baguette. Create a tree diagram by dragging and dropping the sandwich choices into empty boxes to show all the possible combinations for a sandwich from this lunch counter. So before we find out what this student can perform according to this math task, what is it that's actually being assessed? I really think we're assessing how well he can read. We can't know how well that student can perform this math task if this student can't read the problem. So we need to consider, are there students who have reading disabilities who truly need that text-to-speech, both in daily instruction but also on the ACT Aspire, so that we can find out what they actually know about those other content areas. If I want to know what the student knows about math, why wouldn't I let the question be read aloud to him or her? This is a 7th grade science question, again from the ACT Aspire site. A student, Jim, was drinking from a glass filled with ice water on a hot day. Jim noticed that water droplets had formed on the outside of the glass and asked where the water came from. 2 other students, Mandy and Theo, each tried to answer Jim's question. Mandy's viewpoint. Now, I'm not going to read all of this to you, but again, I think that we can tell easily that the first thing that is being assessed here is the student's reading ability. Many students would see the length of this question and just quit. So if the goal is to see how well a student can perform this science task, why wouldn't we give the student text-to-speech in order to determine what he knows about science? Accommodations don't guarantee, don't guarantee that the student will do well. Accommodations allow the teacher to know what the student actually knows or understands about the topic. In this example, the student may not have the knowledge to perform the science task, even when the text is read to him or her. So let's talk a little bit about the difference in classroom accommodations and testing accommodations. All testing accommodations should be used routinely and effectively in the classroom throughout the year. A student should never see an accommodation for the first time on statewide testing. And there are appropriate classroom accommodations and modifications that are not allowed on statewide testing. As a former English teacher, it was often appropriate for students to use text-to-speech to read a difficult novel. The learning expectations may be that the student discern the theme of the book or determine an author's specific technique. The student could listen to that text in order to demonstrate that understanding. However, if that learning expectation is to decode the text, allowing students to listen to the text would be changing the learning expectation, making that a modification. So again, we need to think about what that learning expectation is. So let's talk briefly about extra time, and this is a personal story from my younger son who had a 504 plan, and he on his 504 had an extended time accommodation. And just looking at the assignments, and these are all made up, but what could have been assigned to him in a particular week, he would have math problems assigned on Monday. However, he had extra time, so he might not have to turn those in until Wednesday. However, he got more problems assigned on Tuesday, which he would have extra time. In English, he was supposed to read and annotate a short story and have a Socratic circle on the next day. However, if he had extended time, he might not have to have the story read, meaning he couldn't participate in the Socratic circle on Tuesday. And you can see here that what often happened was that his assignments would just build and build and build until he would just say, I can't do this, I've just got to quit. And so we have to be careful with extended time and exactly what it means. What are we talking about with extended time? Are we saying that students who have 4 days to write an essay, for a student with extended time, that student will have 6 days? Are we saying that in the classroom, if most students take 30 minutes for a test, the student will have 45 minutes? That IEP or 504 has to be very specific on what that extended time means. And all of the teachers who work with this student must understand what that extended time accommodation means and how all of those classes work together. So remember, selecting accommodations is not like a shopping list. It's not best to give all students every possible accommodation. We need to monitor accommodation use to make sure that the accommodations are effective. And we need to consider all accommodations that may be effective for each individual student. We will be talking in part 3 of this about specific accommodations and looking at a website called Accommodation Central that is wonderful for special education teachers and general education teachers to consider different accommodations that they may not be using, how to implement those, and how to monitor their use. If you have any questions, I hope you'll contact me, and remember there are resources available on the LiveBinder. Thank you.